We have 4 items left to go today. Two of them are information-only reports. Item number 13, I think, will be relatively brief, but item 12 is a much more substantive item. So we'll see how we go on item 12, and then I'll get an indication from you as to whether you want to conclude the items before lunch or break for lunch. With that in mind, item number 12 relates to the greater local board decision-making and equity of funding for community service. And what I want to do, first of all, there's a series of recommendations. I've added one recommendation, which essentially asks for staff to monitor the transition and the implementation of the new system of increased local board decision-making responsibilities and provide 6 monthly reports to the governing body as to progress and outcomes. So you'll see that on your screen as a new M. But I will get the recommendations moved and seconded at this time. If I can ask Councillor Daniel Newman to move it and Councillor Coombe to second the recommendations. Can I just have an indication that both of you are happy with that?
Happy to do so, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Coombe? I'll get Councillor Coombe to reply in the chat bar. Look, I'd like to begin by inviting Councillor Newman as the chair of the Governance Framework Review Working Party to make some opening comments. And then I'm going to invite Phil Wilson to add his introductory comments. Phil's been involved with this area over a long period of time. We will then have a PowerPoint presentation from Justine Haves and Gary Pemberton. So, Councillor Newman, if I can ask you please to make some introductory comments.
Well, thank you, Your Worship, and firstly I want to acknowledge members of the Joint Governance Working Party, both in this term and the previous term, who have been involved in this conversation, and to acknowledge the staff who have been working on this now for what is years, and staff can reflect on the journey that they have been through in relation to this. I also want to acknowledge from the outset that it is an incredibly complex issue conceptually for everyone to grasp, and acknowledging that there are probably differences between those of us who have been on the Joint Governance Working Party for a long period of time, our understanding of the operating consequences of the decisions that we seek to endorse today, and those members of the governing body who are not on the Joint Governance Working Party. So for those who haven't been, this is a challenge. But what I would say, Your Worship, is that there are two parts to this. One is the local board decision making over local community services, and the second is the issue of equity funding. If I can just deal with the second matter first, the equity funding. The funding model that we're going to need to continue to work through is a hybrid of the initial proposal, and I think a worthy compromise, noting the political consequences to some elected members and some boards if we had just proceeded with what was initially proposed in terms of funding. So I think that, excuse me, my apologies. So I think that the compromise on the equity funding model is a good one, and it should be adopted today, noting that there will still need to be work done in terms of modelling the impact of the transition. But with respect to the local board decision making, I accept that this is a challenge. Understanding where local board where decision making should sit in the context of the dynamic co-governance model is one that does challenge people to look carefully at who is best placed to understand the consequences of the decision making, and therefore best placed to take decisions. I think that the analysis really supports devolved decision making, understanding that this is not a holus bolus level of decision making in a specific area for the reasons set out. I also want to just, if I may, reflect on some of the challenges that could arise through, or how does the organisation resources people-wise to ensure that decision making is informed by the best advice and analysis, and say that I am confident that Phil Wilson and Louise Mason and others who work with local boards are well placed to understand what will be the resource required to ensure that the local boards are in a good position to make decisions, and that the advice will be provided, and that the people that can give that advice will be available to do so. So I'm happy to move all of the recommendations that are set out, including Chair's recommendation M. I have no problem with that. And I want to acknowledge the officers for the work that has supported us to arrive at the position that has been recommended in the report today. I'm happy to comment later, Your Worship, but thank you for the opportunity to introduce.
Thanks, Councillor, and recognise that there's quite a lot happening in the background where you are at the moment. Phil Wilson, would you like to make some comments at this point?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, it's been a long journey to this point, sort of 4 years or so. I've been the executive sponsor for the work for all of that time. In fact, earlier in terms of the governance framework review work. More recently, Claudia Weiss has joined me, and I'll just ask her to make a comment after I've said a few things at the front end here. Like the chair of the Joint Governance Working Party, I would like to acknowledge the staff, even at this early stage, Justine and Gary, who you'll hear from shortly, John Nash, but also a range of others who have had input through this, from local boards, from finance, from our policy teams and such like. So just a little bit of a shout out to them, but also to the Governance Working Party itself, both in this term and in the previous term. It's important to record that that what you've got in front of you, the recommendations, are very substantially those of the Joint Governance Working Party. So they're supported by staff, yes, and they've been through the executive team, yes, but they also reflect the recommendation from the political arm, comprising both local board representation and governing body representation. There is a slightly different approach suggested by staff to where things ended up with the Governance Working Party, only insofar as it relates to decision making around multi-board services. The team will explain that, but that's a direct consequence of the feedback from governing body through the earlier workshop sessions. So I think you should see some reflection in the recommendations around one aspect of concern that was voiced earlier. But just returning to if you like, the journey, I think it's really important for us all to have kept in mind through this process you know, what is in effect a long history, the legislation that created Auckland, the understanding at the time that it would be refined, the operation of it would be refined over time, the substantial piece of work that was the original governance framework review, the later processes that the Local Government Commission took us through in relation, yes, to the breakaway proposals for Waiheke and Rodney, but quite importantly, the response of the governing body in its submission in response to that work, where there was a commitment made to keep working on this and to progress an increased level of decision making, local discretion, if you like, for boards. So this keeps faith with that, and I would expect to, depending on the outcome of this, to need to close the loop with the Local Government Commission in time. As Councillor Newman mentioned, I do want to acknowledge the complexity and the competing aspects of this, and that some councillors through the process have voiced entirely legitimate concerns. There has been a lot to think about in terms of the transition process around funding equity. There's been a lot to think about in terms of the competing needs of cost management and efficiency with democracy, local decision making, and so on. The tension between consistency of approach and services across the region with the ability to customise services for local communities based on different needs. And of course, the impact that this has on the respective roles of governing body members and local board members. Those have all been carefully and thoroughly considered through the process. And I have to say we've done our level best to try and reflect into this body of work and the recommendations those things. You have in front of you, in a sense, two sets of recommendations, two issues to progress. One is funding equity, the other is the decision-making aspect. Unlike some matters before you from time to time where we would be saying they represent a kind of cohesive whole and need to be considered fully together, they are two separate sets, and it would be possible to progress one without the other. So you might want to reflect that in terms of debate and resolution. They stand together, but also a little independently in terms of what they actually have the effect of doing. Because of the complexity and what have you with this, we have gone back really to, and this is my final point, we've really had to go back to first principles. Funding equity sort of speaks for itself, so I won't labour that. Subsidiarity as a defining principle of governance systems, the idea that decisions closest to the community, that decisions should be made closest to the community affected by them, the recognition that local needs do differ across the region, so local priorities logically differ, so service levels might logically differ. The principle really of incentivising the right decision making, that local boards probably need to have more skin in the game in terms of making cost-conscious decisions and the prudent stewardship of assets. You'll see that theme come through this, and that in any system there needs to be checks and balances. Hence the reference to the ability of the governing body to set regional service level minimums and to retain some control over funding levers for major investment into community service levels. So I apologise for the density of this work. We hope we've done justice to it by answering most of your questions through workshop sessions and 4 years. Time will tell in this discussion. I'll pause at that point and I'll ask Claudia, my co-sponsor of the work, to comment.
Thank you very much, Phil, and kia ora koutou, your worship, councillors and members. I won't speak for long, but I would like to use the opportunity to thank Councillor Newman and the Joint Governance Working Party, but also all other members on this call and your worship for your ongoing input and advice into this work. and also all of the questions that you have raised. We have been very grateful for the information and questions you have sought because we believe it has helped shape and enhance the document and the analysis that you see today. And I know that Justine, Gary and John have worked very hard to carefully respond to your questions. And in doing so, they have also sought and received the input and support from broader teams across council, as Phil just mentioned, including our executive leadership team. So I know and I am confident that the information presented here today has been very carefully considered and analysed. So our team now will take you through a brief presentation, and of course we're very happy to respond with any further questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Justine, I think you'll lead off.
Kia ora, me goff. Thank you very much. And I'll just give Gary a moment to bring up the presentation. But while that happens, kia ora koutou, ko Justine Haves toku ingoa. I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to cover this item today, and to Councillor Newman, Phil and Claudia for your introductory comments. This is a complex topic, as Phil has described, and in the interests of progressing to discussion and questions, I guess, we do intend to take the cover report as read today, and as such our presentation covers a more high-level summary of the proposals and more recent key areas of interest. So I also note that the full report and the examples provided as attachments include a lot of additional detail and hopefully support understanding of these proposals. I can't see the presentation. I'm just checking whether it's come up for anybody else or not.
It's just come up now, Justine. So
okay. It won't be long. Oh, great. Thank you. So as Phil mentioned, this piece of work has been underway for a significant length of time. The proposals that we're sharing today have been shaped and finalised over the last 14 months since the Joint Governance Working Party approved the discussion paper back in August 2020. Engagement since that time over the last 14 months has included 3 governing body workshops, 3 Joint Governance Working Party meetings, that also included councillors and local board chairs, 2 rounds of local board workshops to discuss options and then proposals, and local board meetings to formalise feedback on the proposals. So as Phil and Claudia have commented, we've certainly tried our best to accommodate and reflect the feedback and the input that we have received in the material that you have today. The proposals have changed significantly in response to that input and feedback, and we are seeking to strike the balance in the proposals between local and regional focused outcomes and local and regional decision making. So the content of our presentation acknowledges those discussions, feedback and responses, and will focus on current areas of interest to support your consideration of the recommendations. As Phil described, the proposals are presented in 2 parts, as is reflected on this slide here. So firstly, we will talk to the decision-making proposals for the governing body that we're asking for a decision today, and that would allow for inclusion as part of the annual plan consultation. The second part to the recommendations relates to the equity of funding proposals that do require further development, and we're recommending would be considered subsequently by the governing body in 2022. So I'll start with the decision-making proposals first. And it is important to note or to remind people that for this work, the scope of this discussion is local community services only. So that includes local services such as community centres, pools, playgrounds, libraries, arts and culture centres, and parks. The proposals don't include any changes to regional community services. So with regards to the decision-making proposals, the objectives shown on the slide there are to increase local board responsibility for decisions over the spaces and places that deliver most of their local community services. As Phil mentioned, it's to make local boards much more accountable for their decisions over those services and to align financial responsibility and accountability with changes in decision-making. So these objectives for the decision-making proposals reflect the expectations of the Governance Framework Review Report from 2016 and the recommendations of the Local Government Commission in 2018. They also provide the opportunity to address points of friction between local boards and governing body. In terms of the proposals, the recommendations cover a proposed increase to decision making to the extent that is currently allowed through the allocations policy, but we're also recommending to extend that policy to include asset decisions. The recommendations provide for multi-board decision making, set minimum service levels, and acknowledge the increased resourcing required to provide quality advice relating to these proposals. So with regards to the proposals themselves, more modest approaches were considered, but it was identified that they would not substantially address the concerns or the objectives of this work. And broader-based approaches were also considered, but introduced far greater complexity in application than could be justified for the benefits realised. So I guess the proposals today represent a middle ground to that effect. It is also important to note that if these recommendations are approved by the governing body, these changes would be implemented over time. We will cover that detail in a later slide. But phased implementation does provide the opportunity to carefully monitor and report on any refinements that may be required as we navigate implementation. With regards to the funding allocation proposals, the objectives of these proposals are to increase the equity of funding allocated to local boards to better allow us to reflect the different levels of service need for council services across Auckland, to provide local boards greater certainty over future funding so that they can be more strategic in their decision making with an eye and a view on the longer term benefits and impacts of the decisions that they're making. The funding allocation objectives seek to improve the equity of funding, and as I mentioned, they include the proposal to move from funding assets to funding service need. This will also help ensure we can deliver to our communities of greatest need. They also seek to align funding and decision making so that we can incentivise strategic decisions, as Phil covered earlier, that are more cognisant of those longer term impacts. And in terms of the proposals, they include a recommendation to allocate funding based on local board factors. That includes both ABS, OPEX and CAPEX funding for local community services, as I mentioned earlier. Just a note there that this excludes slip remediation, coastal renewal and asset values, which has been canvassed in earlier proposals. We're recommending a transition funded by growth and future renewals funding, and this is an aspect that needs more work and is a reason why we are recommending that we present further analysis on this back to governing body at a later date. The proposals include shared multi-board funding, and Gary will speak to that soon, and fixed funding for the Gulf Islands. In terms of the proposals, these more structured approaches to funding are important if the governing body is to support local boards to make more joined up and cross-service decisions. And as we've said, local boards would therefore be empowered to make more strategic governance decisions rather than shorter term tactical decisions, as is currently the case. So in terms of the recent discussions that we have had with yourselves, this table represents the kind of key standout issues that we've been canvassing through our recent workshops. This table is essentially drawn from Section E, the Issues and Concerns section of the cover report, and from the Risk and Mitigation section. Discussions at governing body workshops have covered these concerns. We've also talked about alternative approaches and options that have been considered, and in some cases how proposals have been revised to balance concerns with the objectives of the project. So we will cover the first 4 of these issues in the following slides. So I'll just speak to the remaining 3 issues at the bottom of the slide briefly. So in terms of the integration of proposals, this ensures that local boards will have flexibility for service priorities within their funding envelope. So it gives effect to what is possible under the current allocations policy, but operationally is not something we've given effect to yet. In terms of the local government review, there have been questions around how well or if these proposals align with that direction. The local government review is underway, and the recent interim report shows alignment with this direction. Specifically, it asks what needs to change so local government and its leaders can best reflect and respond to the communities they serve, and what should change in local government governance, funding and financing to ensure viability and sustainability, fairness and equity and maximum wellbeing. So we think there's really strong alignment with this direction. In terms of the impact of doing nothing, the cover report speaks to both the Stuyven report and to subsequent Local Government Commission recommendations. As Phil outlined earlier, this piece of work's been underway for a long time to respond to both those things, and a number of options have been explored to achieve these objectives. So I'll now hand over to Gary, who will take you through in a bit more detail those first 4 issues on this table in terms of the additional analysis that we've undertaken and how the proposals and recommendations reflect that additional work. Thank you, Gary.
Kia ora, Justine, and tēnā koutou katoa. The first of the 4 issues on the table was relating to resourcing for quality advice, and local boards in our engagement highlighted their need for improved analysis and advice on their service options. And considering those concerns, these proposals provide for a significant increase in the range and the complexity of the advice to be provided to local boards. And this in turn will enable more effective service options that have not really previously been available for council services. These resources will also contribute to a lift in the effectiveness of local service decisions. In arriving at this estimate of between 16 and 22 FTE at a cost of around $2 to $2.8 million per annum, we've included 5 key drivers. The first is around the transfer of any responsibilities from committees to local boards, and the impact on local boards over and above their engagement in those matters at this current time. We've looked at the support needed around financial analysis of advice and the financial management within budget envelopes. We've also considered how local board plans can take a more influential role and a significant role in decision making, and how that concentration on local board plans can allow for very effective decision making. We've also considered the complexity required in terms of advice on trade-offs between services and options, which to date have not previously been required. And we've also considered local boards seeking a broader range of options to consider around their services and the service levels. In the report, you'll also see we've identified some implementation costs at less than 500k in each of this and the following financial year. The key shift in the provision advice is the more significant role that local boards will play in decision making. I'll touch on that in this next slide. So currently, our local board plans are not as strategic as they could be under circumstances required here. So this change in a more strategic role for local board plans is critical to decision-making proposals. The local board plans demonstrate alignment with the Auckland plan, and they currently outline local board priorities and local initiatives, but they are high level, they are aspirational documents, and they do not necessarily consider the funding implications of those priorities. So under these proposals, local board plans become longer term, thinking about more strategic issues, and they'll reflect local board priorities in existing and in new services. Those plans would also consider the options that local boards have sought advice on and local feedback on those proposals. And so that local board plan now can make service decisions, including trade-offs between those services. So from this shift, service options and the advice support and resourcing is going to be less ad hoc across the 3-year cycle and more focused around local board plan development. So from local board plan adoption, local long-term plans can now incorporate the main drivers of local board plans, their local community services targets and their investment priorities. Local board agreements currently reflect annual service delivery measures and targets and how those services will be funded, and this work supports these local board agreements. And in terms of the delivery of the agreements, work programs set out each year the local board program of work for that year and for the following 2 years. And so we're seeing here that leveraging these planning processes and delivering a consistent and integrated approach to decision making will result in a gradual and a phased implementation of decision making. And Justine alluded to this in the opening comments. And so currently our planning cycle incorporates 4 key planning processes, including our work programs. So this proposed implementation across annual plans, local board plans, and long-term plans results in phased increases in local board decision making over a period of around 2.5 years. The current work program flexibility continues. The annual plan changes proposed under this paper would bring greater flexibility within the existing service delivery activities. Subsequently, asset variations can be made as further advice is received and those contracts can be varied. Then following our local board elections, the work on local board plans commences and are developed, and these plans will allow for those more significant service level changes. And so the increasing responsibility is now becoming clear. The more significant of those changes would require long-term plans to provide for those more significant changes, and this is where the funding impacts, including any new funding impacts, would come to bear. So thinking about the funding approach, and this comes back to the impact of these changes on council activities. So this chart represents the funding under the current long-term plan 2021-31 and demonstrates where the funding is currently being applied by service. Significant of this investment occurs outside the scope of these proposals, as Justine has highlighted, and they remain unchanged. And within those investment lines, we see a number of the benefits from amalgamation. So transport, Three Waters, arts, events, culture and heritage, and our regulatory and planning services. When we look into the local community services funding scope, there are still some significant benefits from amalgamation here, and these will be unaffected by these proposals. So key examples would be full facility contracts, or Project 17 if you like, and integrated workforce approaches that are in place currently at libraries and at our pools and leisure facilities. So today's proposals relate to how decision making over these local community services, 16% shown of this pie, can better represent diverse local needs and interests. So this example demonstrates current funding amounts. Within that scope, $4.9 billion is spread across these activity lines shown here. Local boards currently have some responsibility on some of these elements, and these proposals will increase responsibilities, but by varying degrees. So you'll see under service delivery, we would see increased local board flexibility and local board prioritisation across services. Under asset delivery, we would see, enable existing local flexibility, such as the service levels that are provided for within those full facilities contracts. So under renewals, where local boards currently have flexibility over a 3-year period, we would see increased flexibility supporting longer term service and renewals planning. And finally, under asset delivery, we would see here responsibilities being transferred from the governing body to local boards and how new investments are decided upon and are funded. highlighted earlier in the slide pack were discussions and revisions to the proposals around multi-board services. So whilst multi-board services make up less than 10% of that local community services funding pool, it has generated considerable interest. Within that interest, concerns have been raised about whether there should be a decision-making role for the governing body, given the sub-regional nature of the multi-board services being considered. And in the current report, the recommendation is for a shared decision-making responsibility over these multi-board services. So whilst the funding would remain local, or ABS, as we describe it, the responsibility for those decisions would be shared 50-50. So the governing body committee relevant to these community services would represent the sub-regional interests in decision-making. Local boards would represent the local interests in the other 50% of decision-making. So in terms of the further work for funding, the area of investigation here relates to the allocation of funding to a multi-board service program that would be administered underneath this structure. Moving on to some examples that have been provided just in terms of how these proposals might play out and some of the decision-making examples that you're familiar with. These scenarios were provided to increase your understanding around these proposals and hopefully develop some more depth about the nature of the changes and indeed what's not changing. These were circulated with your agenda papers and as attachment C. So finally, to the implementation of these proposals, and as discussed before, the proposals in front of you for decision making are intended to be consulted on through the annual plan in 22-23. The key aspects of consultation will be around the local board flexibility over services, local board flexibility over within the funding allocation, and relating to the multi-board service identification. Within this engagement with the public over the decision-making changes, it will highlight that there are no significant changes to result directly from your decision. It will be in the local board decisions subsequently that will change service levels, and that these changes will be consulted on through local board plans as we discussed earlier. The second half of the proposals relates to funding. Key areas here are relating to the funding allocation approach and multi-board service funding. So in this relating to the flexibility of funding, we will be further investigating the potential impact on funding sources under this allocation approach. And your decisions today on multi-board services will also inform the outcomes for multi-board service funding. So that concludes our brief summary of the issues that have been traversed over those many meetings and workshops that Justine described. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to hand back to your worship, Mayor, for next steps.
Thanks, Gary and Justine. Look, I think what we'll do at this point is just run it in the normal manner. We'll take questions first. I'm aware that this has been workshopped, and I've certainly raised a lot of questions through workshops and directly with staff. And then we'll move to comments and then have a vote on the proposals. So starting with the questions, Councillor Papacoom is first up.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and kia ora koutou, all those who've been involved in this substantial piece of work. I have got 3 questions, if I may. And apologies if this is buried in the report or has been covered, but I just wondered if this is perhaps a question to Justine around if you could just clarify how what's proposed in terms of the decision making for local boards actually also strengthens the governing body role.
Thank you for the question. So I think kind of returning, I suppose, to the objectives of this piece of work, the recommendations and the proposals reflect the objective to increase local board responsibility for local decisions. So as Gary's described, there will still be, based on the proposals, a very important role for governing body in terms of decisions over multi-board services, and there will be no change to regional community services. So the way in which governing body and local boards work together in terms of a cohesive and overall view of community services will be, very important. What we are recommending is the ability for flexibility for local boards across their service set, I guess, within their local board area, and the funding associated with that.
Thank you. Just in terms of that sort of theme around how this is strengthening overall the governance model, on our governing body reports, we have the heading of local board input. Can you envisage that local board reports will need to be amended so that they can provide also for a governing body input section, just to sort of show that relationship?
That's a new question. I'm just thinking that one through. I guess that would be possible, but I suppose I just would like to be clear that the analysis that we've done so far in terms of resourcing implications in particular anticipates the movement, I suppose, from governing body or committee to local boards rather than a reversal of the input and the decision. So there would be implications of that we haven't considered. So I guess I'm saying it would be possible, but it hasn't been contemplated at this stage.
Thank you.
If I may just add to that response, the nature of the advice that officers would provide local boards on their service decisions would reference any existing material such as our community facilities network plan or our open space plans and that type of thing. So there's certainly that input to the advice that local boards are receiving. And in terms of the proposals for multi-board services, which are a very high profile set of services, as we've described, there's the shared decision-making approach as well.
Okay, well, maybe that needs to be something that's put on the radar, because I guess I'm just thinking around that this is, we're looking at strengthening the governance model overall, so it's not really just a one-way street, and that's probably something that needs to be fleshed out further. Sorry, and may I just, Mr. Mayor, I've just got one other question.
Yep, go ahead.
I was going to kind of pass this up because the report is so thorough and there's so much analysis, but the climate impact statement makes this comment, which pops up every now and again, that the matters discussed in this report do not have a direct impact on climate change. I just don't see how that can make sense in the context of this bit of work, because if local board decision making, this is to strengthen local board decision making, this means that they could be looking at how they're implementing their localised climate impact, climate plans, how they might be doing initiatives locally, what they might be doing in terms of community services that they want to deliver through a climate lens, all sorts of all sorts of things. So I would have thought the starting point for that climate impact statement should really be, we have a climate plan. This is how this, if we support what's proposed, this will actually strengthen that strategic work at a local level.
Yes, I agree that that's an entirely possible outcome, I suppose, of these recommendations. And I guess it's what we were seeking to suggest in the second sentence, which is that absolutely the local boards will have the opportunity to increase their focus in this area, and that the impacts and implications of that would be provided in subsequent advice. Yeah. So I guess it's more a timing question. So that was our intention in terms of the statement made there.
Thank you for that clarification, and I have made this plea before, but perhaps the authorisers of reports could just ensure that that sentence doesn't really pop up again, because it just doesn't make sense for any decision making across council. But that's a plea I've made before. And Mr. Mayor, if I could, I would like to comment when the opportunity arises. Thank you. And certainly, to speak in support. Thank you.
Next question comes from Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Hi, Phil. I've got some related questions. It's easier if I just raise them and the officers can pick them up or pick them off accordingly. So one of the issues I've got is just the larger context in terms of the change that's underway. I'm referring to the Three Waters reforms, the imposition of planning overlays over our city, the financial constraints that are essentially dictated to by government, and the very much changed nature of local government, the review that's underway. So I've just got a real question around managing further change as it goes to this change that I would suggest will be impacted on significantly by those larger changes. Moving on to the next issue, and that goes to baseline information around all the facilities that are under local boards, the different funding models that are presently in place across local boards that go to ownership, that go to leasing, that go to how things are funded. I've raised earlier, for example, the differences in the way youth centres are treated, which varies incredibly from location to location. The same thing applies to community centres and the like. A related issue just goes to how we're going to deal with engagement on the part of the public, because it's complicated enough as it is for members of the public to figure out how to interact with the council and then local boards. I see a further complication here. And I guess the other question just goes to, I would suggest, the dramatically increased workload and competency requirements that this is all going to mean for local boards against an understanding where the role of many people in local boards has been proposed and continues to be a very part-time role, and just how they will frankly cope. So there's some issues that I'd raise, and I guess in terms of how we're approaching something like this, it would be good to have some specific examples and maybe even consider a trial or two. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. There's quite a few questions in there, so Justine and Gary, you might like to work your way through what you discerned out of those questions and comments.
Great, thank you. And I'll start, and then perhaps Gary can follow up with additional comments. So with regards to the first question around the nature of other changes that are underway at the moment, I guess that is where it's really important to recognise that here we're talking about local community services. So some of those other changes that are being explored and contemplated do relate to areas beyond local community services. And as we mentioned, in particular with the local government review that's underway, we do believe that there is strong alignment here in this direction. In terms of the question around engagement and what this means for members of the public, as Gary outlined earlier, significant service changes will be consulted through the local board plan process. So we actually think this gives strength to that consultation. It is obviously consultation that already happens, but we believe that this provides the mechanism for that consultation to be much more meaningful at a local level. And we do acknowledge that that will require additional effort to ensure the public understand the things that are being contemplated, but that is where we also recognise the additional resourcing required to support the quality advice, which will inform the options that local boards can consider. So that perhaps speaks to your third question around the operational implications. So as Gary outlined, we've sought to understand what that means from a staff perspective, but we have also sought input from local board services in terms of the implications for this in implementation. And the feedback that we've had in that regard is that there's essentially a shift, I suppose, in the level of activity that local boards currently undertake, local board members currently undertake in terms of forming their advocacy to the governing body, that activity can essentially, or that resource effort, I guess, can essentially be repurposed to this set of decision making rather than advocacy. So hopefully that answers your questions. Gary, did you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Justine. Just adding to the response to your second question, in terms of the public engagement and change, Justine's covered very, very well how that local board plan consultation process would work. And in terms of the effectively consolidating decision-making responsibilities that are currently split between the governing body and local boards in respect of these local community services, should provide more clarity to residents of those local boards, rather than needing to understand the responsibilities for the service delivery from some of those assets versus the governing body's role in funding those assets. So providing local boards a more comprehensive role there should provide some clarity to residents in terms of local community services.
Thank you. Councillor Al-Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship, and just want to acknowledge all our staff before I ask all my questions. So, Your Worship, just to get some process in place, do you want me to ask? There's about 4 I've got, but they're very quick ones. So do you want me to ask 2 and then wait?
No, look, I think if you put all 4 together, and then we can get Gary and Justine to answer them collectively.
Okay, look, it's the first one's about process. What happens after the election next year and the new incoming governing body is not supportive of the way where we are heading with this recommendations, please? That's number 1.
Your Worship, Phil Wilson, I'll take that first one. I mean, essentially, where this is headed is to redo the decision allocation table, which is a feature of the long-term plan. And yes, any subsequent council governing body can choose to change that, but requires to do consultation in the process of doing so. So a future council is not bound by decisions, but there would certainly need to be a process gone through and a re-engagement with the boards around that.
Okay, Phil, supplementary to that, my first question, you mentioned the long-term plan. Because this is significant, why aren't we waiting for the long-term plan in regards to going out to our community because of its significance in regards to the pūtea and in regards to the mahi associated to this?
Through the Worship, well, actually, Councillor, we did wait for the last one, couldn't get the airtime for that consideration in the last LTP, so it's the decision making that you're being challenged with now is with a view to the next one.
Okay, question is, when region, as in the governing body at this stage, sets the hours, and if I use the libraries as an example, now what happens in regards to the decision making around the regional decision? And I'm not talking about the hours, if it's 10 hours opening, for example. Who has the decision in regards to reducing those hours? With the local boards, do they have the ability to reduce the hours? And if hypothetically 10 hours, they reduce it to 9, is that a possibility and could happen?
I'll go back to you, Gary, if that's okay.
Thanks, Phil. And Councillor Ruff, yes, that is the approach to be taken here, subject to the local board then having alternative uses for any resources that were being applied to that additional hour. And this is really tracing us all the way back to that local board plan in terms of the local board engaging with its community and its interests and priorities. So obviously that decision would need to be demonstrated in line with the feedback of its community, and I fully expect that to be the case.
So Gary, supplementary then, so why are we setting the hours of service if it can be changed by the local boards?
I'm sorry, the hours of service would become a local board responsibility, subject to the minimum service level that has been set and the hours per week. So
Gary, who sets those minimum service levels?
They're with the governing body, and the current proposed minimum service levels would be revisited and potentially revised at each LTP.
At each LTP, but do they have the ability to change those? That's the question I've asked, Gary, is around those minimum service levels.
Yes, the process that Phil Wilson just described would be followed in that focused aspect, just in terms of investigating the benefit of changing that minimum service level relative to Auckland-wide priorities versus local priorities. And that's how those proposals were established in the first place. So that would be the maintenance approach.
If I might, Councillor Filipaina,
yeah.
if your question is, can a local board in itself change a minimum service level and go lower than that, the answer is no.
Oh, okay, yeah, that was the question. So I'm glad you understood that, Phil. Sorry, Gary, if I did explain it properly, but
no, my apologies for misunderstanding.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Your Worship, I've just got two more, and that's it. Your Worship, this particular question is around our assets. Now, the assets will go to the local board, but would those assets be of the type that we're currently going through with our asset recycling and premises that have been approved or are in discussion around sale?
No, so this relates to local community service and service assets, not non-service assets. So what it does afford is the opportunity for local boards to understand the requirements of their portfolio as a whole, and to perhaps more effectively give effect to the intent of the optimisation policy, but it doesn't relate to non-service assets or asset disposal as such.
Okay, Justine, again, sorry, Your Worship, about this, but I just need to get my head clear around this. Not the assets, but Justine, I better leave it because I need to sort of hand it over to somebody else and everything else. But Your Worship, my last question is, I've heard so many, even through our working group, about staff giving advice, and they give advice. What happens if the advice is ignored?
I guess that's possible under the current arrangements as well. So the important thing that we've recognised in our assessment of the resourcing implications is the increased complexity of the advice that will be required, and, as I mentioned, the genuine need to explore options. So what we anticipate through that process that Gary described in terms of a local board identifying ahead of their local board plan what they might like to consider in terms of redistribution of service investment. A really important aspect of that will be the options and the the assessment of implications of those options provided in the advice. So the advice doesn't need to be followed, but it will need to be full and comprehensive to ensure that decision makers are fully informed.
Okay, that still doesn't save the problem. Okay, well, thank you, Your Worship.
Thanks, Councillor. Just a couple of supplementaries to Councillor Filipaina's questions. Who decides whether an asset is a service or a non-service asset, and what's the process there?
So that's quite a comprehensive process that is based on an understanding of service need. So where there is a service need within the community and a confirmed ongoing service need, then assets are classified as service assets. The asset recycling process therefore focuses predominantly on assets that have been considered no longer required for service. So there's quite an extensive process that is followed to make that assessment, and that process is led by Community Facilities and Eki Panuku, and significant internal consultation in terms of staff advice supports that assessment.
But the decision, sorry, it should have been a bit clearer, the decision as to where to transfer something from being a service to a non-service asset or vice versa, is that made at the governing body level?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a pretty wide-ranging question, but if something went terribly wrong with this and we had rogue decisions being made at a local level, what would be the process for remediating a situation like that?
I think there's probably two parts to my answer, but I'd like Gary to have a chance to follow up as well. I think as has been described, the minimum service levels are a really important aspect of this, and as was clarified by Phil, local boards will be required to adhere to the minimum service levels. So there's certainly the opportunity for those to be reviewed, as Gary mentioned, through each long-term plan. So if there's an unintended consequence, that can be addressed. I think too, though, the phased implementation is a really important aspect of this, to make sure that we've got time to prepare, to build the capability that's needed of both staff in terms of the advice that's needed to be provided, and in terms of local board members understanding the implications of this. So the suggested recommendation of monitoring and regular reporting will also enable us to keep a close eye on implementation as it progresses.
If I could just tighten that question a little, if the governing body perceived something that was happening at a local board level that had, in its views, unacceptable consequences, do you have to wait for the long-term plan to determine a minimum service level, or can you do that? Can you do that at any time?
We've anticipated that happening through the long-term plan.
You see where I'm driving at. If we saw something going terribly wrong, unanticipated, nobody outside a particular small group of people thought that it was sensible, you could remediate it by altering the minimum service level, but how quickly could you do that?
Yeah, I guess the important aspect here, where we're talking about significant change, is that local board plan consultation process. So as we mentioned, the service priorities would be identified prior to development of a local board plan, and the advice that we provided would need to be really thorough in terms of those implications. So
you'd try to do the fence at the top of the cliff by, they would have to signal, say, a disposal of something that might have been seen as an asset of fundamental importance. You'd be able to pick that up at an early level, and
that's right.
So it wouldn't come as a bombshell. Okay,
No,
I think
right.
I think that helps me. Next question, Desley Simpson.
Thanks, Mayor. My first question is to Phil Wilson. Phil, you said that the recommendations here were as a result of the joint working parties thinking. Can you just confirm, was the Joint Working Party unanimous in their decisions around this?
Look, to be honest, Councillor, I don't have that in front of me. I think the answer is yes, but no. Okay.
No, sorry, Phil.
I think it's important to note that it wasn't a unanimous decision, and I think that's important. The way that you gave your beginning with respect gave me the impression that it was unanimous, and I found out that it wasn't. So I think that's just a point of clarification in that question. But my second question is around the risks with this. And the paper talks about the fact that this proposal is premature in light of possible significant changes under the local government review and might subsequently need to be further changed or prove unnecessary. So my question is, why are you asking us to spend more money, involve more staff at a time that we are financially constrained when, as a result of the local government review coming up, this all might prove to be completely unnecessary?
I'm happy to start with a response to that. Thank you for the question. As we've noted, we think there's strong alignment with the direction of the local government review. This work has already been underway for a significant period of time in recognition of the fact that there's more for us to do in terms of delivering on the intent of Auckland Council, and I guess there's, the review is at early stages, so there's a risk that if we wait for the review, then an extensive period of time will see no further change and may not result in any change once the review concludes. So based on our assessment of the strong alignment at the moment with the direction, we're recommending that the decisions proceed.
So thank you for that, but that's not what the paper says.
Do you want to clarify that, Councillor?
Well, that is not what the paper says, Your Worship. The Worship says under risks, it says that the proposals are premature. The paper also says that there are, in light of possible significant changes under the local government review, might subsequently need to be further changed or prove unnecessary. The paper does not say that they believe the review will follow this course of action. I am just reading what's in the paper. She's saying one thing and the paper says something else. I'm just asking for clarification.
Through Your Worship, that's framed as a risk statement, a potential that could happen.
I'll leave it there, Your Worship, and reserve my right to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there is a risk in anything that we do now might be contradicted by the future of local government review. But my guess is that I wouldn't hold my breath on waiting on anything much for what might or might not come out of the local government review and whether it would be binding or suggested or whatever. That might just indicate a degree of scepticism on my part about the purpose of that local government review. But let's see. Let's move on to the next question, which is Councillor Shane Henderson.
Yes, thanks, Mayor. And I do reserve my right to speak. And a lot of the questions that I had prepared have been asked by previous speakers, which is great. So that should save us a little bit of time. But my first question is, if we're increasing the level of work for a local board member to read and get their head around, will this mean that local board members will need to be full-time to perform their roles adequately?
Good question.
Sorry, Phil, was it you? No,
go ahead, Justine.
Happy to start. So as I mentioned earlier, the feedback that we've had so far from local board services is that the advocacy role that local boards currently play in terms of input for the governing body will essentially mean that they can refocus that effort for decision making within local community services.
So basically, if I'm paraphrasing that, it means that local board members will not fulfil so much of an advocacy role for their communities, which I would have thought would have been a core element of their role. So am I understanding that correctly?
So I suppose what I'm meaning is that they will have responsibility for the decision making. So the advocacy need won't be as great because they will have they will hold the responsibility for the decision making themselves.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I had questions around whether it should be in the LTP rather than the annual plan, and also timing around the local government review, which have been both addressed, which is good. Do you think this will make governance decisions easier and more transparent to an ordinary person on the street?
Thank you for the question, and Gary might like to follow with this, but I think as Gary mentioned before, yes, we think that the opportunity for local community service decisions to be traversed through the local board plan process provides an opportunity to strengthen that consultation that already happens with local communities. So it is important, again, to remember the scope is local community services when we're not talking about regional community services. So this is to give effect to that principle that that the local boards are in a position to be closer to their local community and therefore for it to be more meaningful for the community themselves.
Okay, one final question, thanks Mayor. Just in the resolution under E, I note that staff have very helpfully defined attracting more than 50% of users from other local board areas as a multi-board service. I guess I've got two questions around that. So firstly, how did we come up with that definition? And secondly, how do we define what is a regional service versus a multi-board service?
Gary, would you like to lead off on that one?
Thank you. Excuse me. The definition of multi-board service is relating to our existing local board service envelopes, if you like, or the services that are currently described as local board services. Within the criteria that have been proposed for multi-board services, we're looking at services that are seeing more than half of their users coming from outside the local board that they are located in, the host local board as we call it, and that the services are of a reasonably substantial size, and there's a dollar cost threshold set on that multi-board service to differentiate. The approach here is to see those multi-board services as part of a cluster in that local board cluster environment for understanding how they complement each other in the sub-regional sense, but to maintain a reasonably high level of that local engagement with the service levels, and conversely recognising that broader sub-regional benefit that needs to be considered across a wider range of users.
Sorry, can I just narrow down my sort of follow-up question? So if we're talking about a multi-board service, what's a multi-board service versus a regional one? Because it seems like sub-regional versus regional is a fairly fine line to me. So where would we draw that line?
And the test we've applied here is the relative balance between the outcome of that service being more substantial on an Auckland-wide basis than on a local basis. So on the balance, we're describing that within the threshold of existing local services, these multi-board services are still substantially local for the purpose of that Auckland-wide versus local definition. There has been some questions asked through the engagement process around whether some of the services that are currently defined as local services should be considered regional instead, and then fall under the governing body's both funding and decision-making responsibilities. But we hadn't identified that any of the services that we were considering actually reached that threshold of being more significant Auckland-wide than they were to that local cluster.
Thank you. Reserve my right to speak. Thanks, Mayor.
Sorry,
Is
it okay if I just do a quick follow on with that too, just to note that the Community Facilities Network Plan, as Gary mentioned earlier, clearly outlines in the provision guidelines section around the difference between regional and local facilities. So as we've acknowledged, that important policy still remains the foundation, I guess, in terms of any advice on those aspects.
Thank you. Next question, Kathy Casey.
Thanks, Phil. I'll be supporting the recommendations, but I do want to voice my concerns, which are still there. And the first is, and I think, Phil, you started this by talking about the uncertain world we live in and the government reforms, but I am really, really concerned that COVID is going to be with us forever, and we may not operate in the same way as we have done ever again. And that might relate to some of the services that we're talking about today. So that was the first one. There's no answer to that. I'm just raising it as an issue. One of my real concerns is the resourcing and staffing implications. And I'll preface it by saying that I'm really jealous that it looks like every local board is going to get a FTE to give them integrated quality advice. And boy, would I love that as a councillor. So I'm just going, it's a giant meow, because when you're sitting around the council table, we often talk about the well-resourced local board land. So I'm just saying that if you could just explain to me that budget, because when I do my maths, it looks like there are up to 21 new staff members at 100k a time. And is this not something that we can handle in-house? Or with the current staffing? So it's that I thought that Desley might ask this one actually, but she went somewhere else. So I'm just interested in the answer to that, and I've got one more which I'll just get out at the moment, and that is, I think somebody else said, wearing a black hat. What if this works great in some places and not so great in other places? Is there any chance for the governing body to look back in on it? Because it looks like once the decision's made today, we're kind of out of it until we get to the long-term plan. Is that right? So if there was, when I look at that timeline, is there any chance for a peep in at governing body level after various landmarks have been passed?
So I'll speak to the resourcing question first. So just to clarify, that assessment of 16 to 22 additional staff is not proposed to be allocated to individual local boards. So that's our assessment of the additional FTE equivalent that will be needed within Customer and Community Services Directorate and within finance in terms of support for all of the advice that will need to be provided across boards. So it's not dedicated local board advice. We have also tried to be really conservative in that estimate too, to give confidence that we're not understating, I guess, the requirement there. So it's not a straight salary cost. It also includes an estimate of overhead provision that is applied to every employee in the organisation. So it's kind of quite a comprehensive view, I guess, of the additional cost of those people. So hopefully that clarifies that question. And your question around what is the opportunity, I guess, to continue to keep an eye on this. So as I mentioned, the additional recommendation, I think, certainly helps in terms of 6-monthly reporting on the progress of this work to governing body. And we've just also had clarification in the background from legal. Thank you, Katie. Just on the point around the question of whether decisions can be made at annual plan or only at long-term plan, just to note that they can be taken at any time, but those allocation changes do need to be recorded in both the long-term plan and in each annual plan. So I guess, the assurance that there's not just a 3-year kind of look in here. We're certainly committed to monitoring and reporting on progress and to adapting as we need to.
Thanks, Justine. If I might just have one supplementary. The committee that this will have an effect on, probably the only committee, is the PACE committee. What is the actual effect in terms of the workload? Is it marginal or is it substantial?
That's a very good question. I would say it's marginal, but Gary's undertaken that analysis in quite a lot of detail. So I'll just ask Gary to respond to that in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Justine. And yes, the local community service matters, as we described them in the analysis, made up a relatively small proportion of the agenda/workload of advice to the PACE committee. It's not to say that that is reflective of the committee members itself, but there were, in terms of pieces of advice to PACE, they were of a relatively small proportion up to the total workload in terms of items being received. And most of the advice that we looked at in terms of this resourcing effort, around 96% of the advice was for the benefit of local boards, and that many of the items that were presented to PACE on these matters had actually gone through local boards previously for their input as well.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Justine.
And thank you for the comment that the minimum service levels can be set at any time. That is some reassurance, because I think that's one way we can determine that if this doesn't go as we hope and anticipate, there is a way of correcting, any rogue action that might be taken. So that's important. And Councillor Casey, that's why I've put in as a chair's rec the 6 monthly reports, because I think we need to monitor this pretty closely to make sure it does not have unanticipated and unintended consequences, which is, I think, your concern and mine and others. Next question is Councillor John Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm broadly supportive of the localist elements of this item. I guess the thing that I've always struggled to understand, despite valiant efforts, is really how the particular equity of funding proposal works out on the ground, and particularly as it goes to the environment. Big chunks of Auckland find themselves in that, and that is, a constrained financial environment, existing shortages or shortcomings in provision of various services, and a really fast expanding populations. And I think of the areas that won't be classified as deprived, okay, they won't hit that deprivation. And what I haven't really got any insight into is the scenarios or examples that might exist as to how that division of 80, 15 and 5 might affect, and I'm thinking particularly of the provision of parks going forward. So I'm assuming in the first instance that these massive big subdivisions where the developers essentially put in their own park infrastructure, their little small parks and main playgrounds. But as far as bigger parks go, sporting parks, whether it be a series of fields or a single field, how that might conceivably be tipped one way or the other in this model going forward to areas where they're classified as deprived, but really if we're talking about access to one or more of these facilities, then the deprivation is equal in terms of access. It's not any different, but it is different in terms of the definition that's used. So rather long-winded, Mr. Mayor, but I really don't have any idea how that balance or that formula will work in the environment in which we find ourselves, which is a number of factors that make things difficult or more challenging. I would suggest that in the years ahead. So can anyone give me any advice or insight into how I might reasonably anticipate that? Has any thought gone into it? I assume there has been.
Yes, so I'm happy to start and hand to Gary again. Certainly work has been done in this space, but I guess just to acknowledge that it is also a key reason why the recommendation at this stage is that we continue that analysis and report back to the governing body before decisions are made to this effect. And that is in response to similar questions that have been raised in prior sessions around exactly this point. So as you've noted, the 80% population aspect is a key way in which we recognise the changing population in Auckland. But I think it is also important to acknowledge that we are talking about trying to, I suppose, also understand how we need to make a shift from how we focus predominantly on assets to trying to take a broader view about service requirements. So hopefully that gives some assurance that yes, we're already doing work in this space and we acknowledge the need to do more work in this space, which is why we're not asking for these decisions today. We're asking for support and principle to continue doing that work. Gary, you might like to follow on.
Reserve my right to speak to that one, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, when the time arises.
Thanks. I think if we look at the sections, and I'm just contemplating whether we vote when we come to it on clauses A to M and then the new N to Q separately, but on the inequities, which is what your question's addressing, John, the recommendation is support and principle, and the other are simply noting points. So there's still work to be done. So it's a question of whether this is a question in the latter part of our recommendations of giving a direction that we want staff to go ahead and come back with some more definitive answers around things such as what you've asked about. Okay, Linda Cooper, next question, please.
Thank you, Worship. I've got a couple of questions, if you'll indulge me. One is around the multi-board decision making. And I'm wondering why that can't happen now, why we can't create a category now, because I really do support the equity part of this, the second part of it, but I've got some real concerns as others have expressed. So why cannot local boards work in these multi-board services categories now? Because when we've got those shared, I'd say sub-regional facilities like libraries and pools.
If I may respond, Councillor, the challenge currently, firstly with decision making, is decision making across the key elements of providing the service, and so this is where the service delivery flexibility that local boards currently have does not quite align with the decision making over the assets that are required to provide some of those services. And so the multi-board service approach would be effectively a combining and the sharing of those currently joint responsibilities, as opposed to other more local services being solely local board decision making responsibilities.
Okay, I don't really, I'm still not sure why local boards can't join together and do that, but still that's that. The other question is, I just wonder, with more and more devolution, we are supposed to be co-governance, and for me it doesn't feel like that, because there's a lot of input from local boards about what the governing body do, but there's no very much ability to be reported to about those decisions that local boards make, or for us to input into those decisions. How do you see this making us more co-governance? I feel like it pulls us even further apart and there's even more opacity in this proposal.
Again, happy to start, and Gary might like to follow. So I guess what we're remembering, again, the scope is local community services. So we're not seeking to change decision making across other areas that currently sit with the governing body. As I mentioned, there will need to, in order for services to be strong and cohesive for communities, there will need to be a really good understanding of the interplay between local community services and regional community services, and to that regard, regional policies still very much will guide the advice that is provided to local boards. So the consistency, I suppose, of the advice that's provided to local boards and to governing body in that regard will always be anchored in that policy foundation that's set by the governing body. Gary, you might like to add to that?
No, I think that was a good summary. Thank you, Justine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Is that the end to that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I now have a question from Councillor Fessel-Collins.
Oh no, I'm okay, thanks, Mayor. It was answered in the equity part, and I'm happy to comment later. Thank you.
Okay, and just before I come to Councillor Al-Filipina, the new clause M would come before the addressing inequities in local community service funding. It relates to increasing local board decision making over local community services. So just to correct that in case anybody's misled. Last question, Councillor Filipina.
Thank you, Your Worship, and just want to say thank you for the governing body for allowing me to speak again and ask a question. My first one, when I say first one, Your Worship, I got a question of clarification, and that was in regards to a comment you made around the minimum standards, and you said that we could at least, if there's a rogue local board, that we could look at them every year, but I thought Justine said we could only look at them every 3 years as per the long-term plan. So is that correct, Justine?
No, we had some clarification from legal on that, Alf, to say that we could set the minimum service levels at any time, but I'll just get Justine to confirm that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So I guess what we're proposing is that they are set through the long-term plan, but legal has confirmed we have the opportunity to do that more frequently as needed.
And what I was suggesting, Alf, is that is one mechanism by which we could deal with a situation if it may be unlikely, but it also could happen, where we had, as I described it, a rogue board that decided to do something that everybody thought was bonkers and that would have damaging implications. That's one instrument by which we might be able to correct that. It's presumably not the only instrument.
Yeah, no, thank you, Worship, because that was one of the concerns. So thank you for addressing that. My question is, what are the risks that are associated if we wait for the next LTP to start this particular process, as in that we end up going out with the proposals as per, I think, 146, which is to go out in the next LTP and consult on the decision-making proposals. And that question is based on the economic, financial position we'll find ourselves in after we get out of this lockdown. So what are the risks for us to start this process in 2024, which is a long-term plan?
So Phil might like to follow on, but I'm happy to start with an answer. I guess the risk is in not making progress or giving effect to the intentions of this piece of work, which have been recognised for some time as an in principle, and including with the governing body, of course, an in principle area where we do need to make some progress. So, the work's been underway for some time. The need for the work has been signalled for some time. So, I guess it's just therefore it takes longer to make that progress in terms of equity.
Nothing that I would add to that. Thank you, Your Worship.
So Your Worship, this is where I think the crux for me is, and I'm going to ask this question around equity, because I know that we all want to put in place a remedy around the equity issue. So are you saying that we cannot consult on these in 2024, and as a result, if we do, the equity issue cannot be addressed in the next 3 years?
No, let me have a go at it, and somebody will correct me if I've got it wrong. The proposal here is that the first section on local board decision making over community services, local community services, would go out to consultation in the coming annual plan, and the inequities, addressing inequities, would go out to consultation in the next long-term plan, which is 2024. And the reason for the latter being delayed is because there is still work to be done on it. If councillors were of a mind that they wanted to see both go out together at the delayed date, then that might involve an amendment to recommendation B, which would change the annual plan 2022 to 23 to the long-term plan 2024 to 34. I'm not sure that I would personally support that at the moment. I'd think about it. That would be a way of delaying it. But then the question is, what is the reason for delaying it? Because I think we'd need to have a good reason to put it off, given that the work is pretty much complete, whereas it isn't for the inequity. Does that clarify it for you? And please, Justine or Gary or Phil, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that correct, Phil?
If I may, yeah.
Gary?
The design around the implementation and its phasing is to recognise the role of the long-term plan in terms of the funding instrument, and so it's important that the funding allocation is addressed in an LTP. It can be addressed elsewhere, but not as elegantly. The approach taken here with the decision-making responsibility is to allow for that preparation to apply these changes in responsibility to local boards so that they can bring those responsibilities to the thinking around their annual plan and their local board plan. The local board plan being the very significant document to actually articulate how they propose to manage their services over the subsequent period and into that LTP, and that provides a really sound base both for local board members and for governing body and councillors to understand the implications of both the local board and the funding elements within the long-term plan. So if you like, it's the advanced work that is required to give effect to the decision making that needs to be completed in time for the long-term plan.
Okay, does that clarify it for you, Alf?
Your Worship, I was going to put an amendment up for it to go through to the long-term plan, but I take on board what your advice is, which is really you won't accept it or support it only because of the financial situation we'll find ourselves. The equity issue will be addressed in 2024, as you pointed out, and Phil Wilson pointed out. But look, I know there's one more question from Councillor Henderson, and I'm just going to contemplate, Your Worship. I need to have a cup of coffee and look in the mirror and see what I'm going to do from here.
Okay, look, it's not a case of me not accepting it. If you move it as an amendment, then it would be an order and I would accept it. I'm just not sure that there is a ground to delay it. We either want to do it or we don't want to do it. The only ground might be that there are financial implications at a time when we're pretty tight. Councillor Shane Henderson, a question from you, and then I'm just going to ask advice of councillors whether you want to have a break for lunch. It's now 2 o'clock and then come back for comments, or whether you want to push on. So think about that while Shane asks his question. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thanks, colleagues, for letting me go again. So could I ask staff to comment further about the Māori impact statement in this report as it relates to devolved decision making? And I ask this because currently governing body has the wisdom and input of the IMSB. We'll soon have Māori ward councillors. We have guaranteed Māori voices on these issues as of right. So how would we plan to replicate that situation at a local level?
So I think the short answer to that is that further work needs to be done in that regard, but the report attempts to confirm our commitment to doing exactly that. So we know that in this space, the experience or the practice can be variable across different local boards. But the report and the Māori impact statement and the recommendation are all designed to signal a really strong intent to make progress in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Look, I think there'll be a number of people that want to comment on that. So this item's not going to be resolved quickly. By a vote of 1-0 in the chat bar, suggests that we should have a break now. I haven't heard anybody else suggest 2. Okay, yeah, the votes are rolling in now. Let's have a break. We'll resume at 2:30 and we'll go straight to comments. So if you want a comment, I've got so far Councillors Poom, Cashmore, Henderson, Walker and Dalton. And there'll be Councillor Newman I see now, yep, and more. So I think the vote is in favour of a break. Let's take a break and let's resume at 2:30. So thanks very much, councillors. We'll see you back at that time.